All right, looks like we are recording, and I am very excited to have on the program Dr. Alka Chandna, who is the Vice President of Laboratory Oversight and Special Cases at PETA, the much maligned PETA. And I have been, if anybody has been watching my channel for a substantial number of time, I'm always singing the praises of PETA. And so one thing is I want to talk to you a little bit about PETA, Alka, but I also just want to say, just on a personal note, um, having worked with a team of like really professional people, like when we have reached out to PETA and specifically to you for help, we have always got these prompt replies, so courteous, so professional. I've always found you and everybody at PETA to be so helpful. And so I'll start with a thank you and a welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Well, your experience of PETA mirrors my experience of PETA when I started in the animal rights movement back in the early 1980s, because I learned that there was something that focused on animals. And, I was concerned about animal welfare. We had a dog at home whom I loved. Anyway, I learned that there was this whole thing. Soon after that, learned that there was an organization called PETA. So I started writing to PETA, and they sent me all sorts of literature. They sent me, tips on how to be an activist. So how to write a news release, how to table effectively, how to hold a demonstration, how to call the media, all of these sorts of things, how to do an interview. So helpful. And this was, since it was the early and then mid 1980s, it was pre-internet. So, so PETA was doing undercover investigations at the time, of course, or working with the ALF, or receiving footage, et cetera, from the ALF, of raids that had been done in various facilities, and that PETA was producing these videos that were on VHS tapes, and they had sort of a lending library with these VHS tapes, where they would send you the video, you could watch it, and what we would do is screen it for our animal rights group, local animal rights group, and then we'd return it, and it was free. So it was just a way to show, well, for us to see for ourselves what was going on in these facilities, and for us to share that information with other people, pre-internet, pre-YouTube, pre all of that. So, yeah, and there have been times when I'd wanted, as a grassroots activist, I wanted to hold a demonstration, wanted some advice on how to do it, meaning, what should the sign say when Katie Lang is in town and we want to have, some kind of cool outreach. We've got a rib fest in town. What might we do there that's interesting and creative and not just causing people to be super angry, which they tend to be anyway. But, people at PETA always had time for me, and it's something I've never forgotten. It's something that I try to emulate. But yeah, it has been in my experience, the organization has always treated me well. When I was a grassroots activist, and I like hearing that people at PETA are doing well by the grassroots, since we're all part of the same movement, working toward the same goal.
Yeah, I would say in my pretty limited, time in the movement, it's only been like 7 years. PETA stands out as one of the groups that really supports the grassroots. And I mean, you mentioned the ALF, and if you could read like Ingrid's book Free the Animals about the ALF and how the ALF came to America. So that's something right there. And then a lot of it, like as you described, was receiving footage or investigations or whatever communiques from the ALF and putting it out there. So yeah, it's interesting to me how PETA is not more lauded as one of those groups that has really focused itself on. And I'll ask you about that a little bit later. But just to touch on what you said, I can also share. I very recently there was a Pride event in Tennessee that I wanted to just do some tabling. I was like, let's get the animal message out there too. So I emailed someone at PETA. And by the way, if anybody doesn't know this, you can also do this. Email PETA if you have some kind of thing that you want to do. and they will send you so much stuff. Y'all sent me like t-shirts, stickers, literature, pamphlet, all this stuff, a bag. I mean, I didn't ask for all that stuff. I was just like, hey, do y'all have any like kind of a pride themed stuff? And then they asked me like my shirt size and all that. It's really amazing. So I really appreciate that. You make activism easy. You also just make, getting signs, stickers, whatever it is, just really affordable for activists who can't really afford it. So that's something that I appreciate about PETA. Now, when I asked you to come on the program, you had mentioned several investigations that PETA was putting out recently. Now, we saw one that came out on Monday. Why don't we start there? Because it's particularly gruesome. Now, I realize if you've been doing this work for a long time, it's not going to stand out as like, it's something that we've seen before, as noted in this investigation and what you've put out. You have mentioned that this is like, this is what you see in laboratories, but it is upsetting to look at. So why don't you just tell me a little bit about that investigation that came out?
Yeah, to clarify, that was actually not an undercover investigation. That was footage that we received from an insider who worked at the facility. So this is Massachusetts General Hospital, which is affiliated with Harvard Medical School. It's a teaching hospital for Harvard. And it has, when people think hospital, they think, oh, people, medical doctors, people who care for you, nurses, you go there when you're sick, and all of that is true. But a lot of these hospitals also have research facilities associated with them. On different floors of the hospital, you'll find laboratories. And that was the case here, where the insider worked in some of these laboratories. They worked in primate laboratories predominantly, and that's the footage that they shared with us. So, when you see a lot of this footage, you sort of become inured to it. But at the same time, if you allow yourself to empathize with what the animals are experiencing, it's heartbreaking and devastating every single time. So some of the monkeys who we see, well, first of all, I should say, a lot of what was seen, shared, in the insider's video footage, a lot of that footage depicts treatment that complies with animal welfare standards in the United States. So you see monkeys in cages that are barely bigger than their bodies. These are stainless steel cages, where they might just have, like a little window out of which they can see. They're often caged alone. That was happening at Mass General, caged alone, even though they're, remarkably social beings, just like human beings, other primates just like us. So they're often caged alone, and they were at Mass General. They might be able to take one or two steps in any direction. They're kept in windowless rooms, cinder block walls, no natural light in there, is just fluorescent light, no natural air flow. It's just, the airflow from the vents. And really, they're deprived of everything that's natural and normal and important to them. No companionship, no ability to go outside, no ability to control their environment, which is probably the biggest thing of all, that they have no agency. Their agency has been stripped of them, no autonomy. And so we see in the video footage shared by the insider that the monkeys are exhibiting signs of extreme psychological distress. They're going insane. So, some monkeys are rocking back and forth. Some are circling in their cages. Some have gone so far as to tear out their own hair. A primatologist with whom I work, Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel, she explained this thing, which is erroneously called alopecia in monkeys and laboratories. They call it alopecia, which means hair loss. We all know that. But alopecia is a biomedical condition. Your hormones are out of whack, you get hair loss. But what's going on in laboratories is that these monkeys, they know they can't control anything about what's happening in their lives. And one thing that they can control is their hair, and they tear out their hair because that's something they can control. So it's just so devastating when you think about, that place where those monkeys are, the psychological space that they occupy, that this is what they are driven to do, and then a more extreme example of that self-harming behavior, of course, is when they bite their own flesh. And there was evidence of that, even video footage of a monkey, biting his shoulder, the flesh on his shoulder. So we see all of these things. So that's sort of like the baseline, that even before the experiments begin, this is how they live. So these are monkeys who are profoundly intelligent. They're very social. They're sensitive animals. And yet they live in these conditions of extreme privation, conditions where, they have nothing. They have nothing.
And just to cut in, I mean, I think, an argument of an experimenter might be that monkeys are so similar to us that that's why we experiment on them. Well, if that's the case, then they're also suffering in a similar way that we would suffer inside of these cages, and which is very obvious to see.
That's exactly right, Jeremy. And then, what we would also add to that really good observation that you just made is the fact that, if I lived in a telephone booth, my metabolism would be totally different than what it is right now. It's no different for monkeys, in the wild, in the savannah, on the savannah, or in the forest, or where monkeys might live in nature. They might be traveling 4 kilometers a day, and and going in the trees and climbing trees and doing this and doing that, and being really engaged in their environment. Their metabolism is totally different when they're trapped in a lab, when they're imprisoned in a laboratory. Their physiology changes, their biochemistry changes, everything changes. Their neurology changes. I mean, think of what it would be like to have, it's really like you think about living a life in, these 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions, if you include time, and things are changing. And, I have to look to see if my cat is going to come and sit on my lap. I'm hungry, I'm going to go and get something to eat. I've decided that I'm going to go for a walk. There are all of these ways in which I'm engaging in my environment. And my neurobiology is challenged by that. And so I'm engaged and things are going on. But for a monkey in a laboratory, or frankly, for a mouse or a rat in a laboratory, all of that shuts down. And so their neurobiology changes. I mean, we all hear about this. This is why a lot of us spend time doing crossword puzzles or Sudoku or what have you, is because we know we have to engage our brains, because otherwise, there are going to be whole bits of neurocircuitry that just die. And that's what happens to animals in laboratories. There are portions of their neurocircuitry that are no longer working. Which is why it becomes so ridiculous then that we use them as stand-ins for human beings, when, frankly, animals in laboratories would not be good models for their counterparts in the wild, in nature. A mouse in a laboratory is not a good model for a mouse who lives, in a barn somewhere.
Right.
A rat in a laboratory isn't a good model for a rat who lives in New York City's sewer system. We're talking about, even though they're the same species, their biologies have become totally different because of the imprisonment versus being a free animal.
Yeah. And I mean, depression, anybody who's been through depression or any kind of mental struggles knows that it can be also physically debilitating in some cases. So, yeah, that can definitely change how you behave, how you do all these things that the experimenters are recording. And we know this, right? We know that animal studies yield very few results that are relevant to humans, right? What's the number? I see the number at 5% or something like that.
Yeah, there are different aspects of, what you can consider when you think about the translatability of data from animal experiments to human relevant data. One would be to say, well, I mean, if you have a discussion with somebody who is arguing that we need to use animals, one of the first things they'll say is, well, I don't want new drugs tested on me. And that's like, fair enough. Yeah. But, according to the Food and Drug Administration, 95% of all new drugs that test safe and effective in animal studies are found to be either unsafe or ineffective in human beings. So that's your 5%, right? Only works 5% of the time. But you don't know what 5% of the time is working. And one of the things that I think about is that when I was in university, I had a lot of friends who were underemployed, musicians and other people who just didn't make enough money to survive. And one of the things that they would do is enroll themselves in these clinical studies. So a new drug, right now, the standard testing paradigm is that they go through a few phases of animal tests, and then they go into 3 phases of clinical tests using human beings. They say volunteers, but, they're paid a stipend, well, 30 years ago, it was $700 for a weekend. But the thing is that if the animal tests are failing 95% of the time, the people who are the real quote unquote guinea pigs are those people who are in the first stage of clinical testing. Those are the people who are really putting their necks out on the line, because the testing that happened up to that point isn't really telling us whether that drug is safe. And there are plenty of examples of absolute catastrophes that have occurred because of the animal testing that occurs before the first stage of human testing. So this is a failure in so many ways, and humans are harmed as a result. There are a lot of things that can be said here. We know people, your listening audience, who have dogs at home, everybody knows you don't give chocolate to a dog. That's the simplest example of how substances that, may give me a stomach ache, may make me hate myself if I eat a lot of chocolate. It's not going to kill me, but it can kill a dog. This is really important to understand. We have different physiologies, different biologies, different metabolism, the whole thing. There's the famous story of penicillin, that when penicillin was discovered, there was a shortage on the world market of guinea pigs who were the preferred test subject. And because there was that shortage, they ended up using a different animal, I think rabbits, and an infection that was given to rabbits was cleared up with a penicillin. I hope I'm remembering that correctly. Later, they found out that, this part I do remember very well. Later, they found out that penicillin is actually toxic to guinea pigs. And I believe it was Fleming who said, how fortunate it was that there weren't guinea pigs available at the time, because then we would have concluded from those tests that penicillin was unsafe, and the whole world of antibiotics would have never been known to humankind. So, there are examples of that sort as well. So there's drug testing, where you have the 95% failure rate. And when you parse that out into different types of drugs, some drugs, the failure rate is even greater, up to 99% or more. And then there's like basic research, which is what, happens in most universities, curiosity-driven experiments. These are the focus of many of our campaigns. There's, stuff going on in universities. And there was a really interesting study that was done by this guy named John Ioannidis, who's at Stanford University. And what he and his colleagues did was they looked at the 5 top biomedical journals, and they pulled from those the studies that had highly promising discoveries, things that people thought would like shake, how we treat human beings that have diseases, conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And they took those highly promising discoveries from the 5 top journals and went forward 20 years to see how many of those highly promising discoveries actually ended up changing what happens at the human patient bedside. Did those discoveries end up developing treatments or cures for human beings?
Mm-hmm.
And the result of that study was that less than 10% of those highly promising discoveries, most of which involved animal studies, less than 10% actually gave us something that positively impacted what happens at the human patient bedside. So there you
Yeah.
have, and less than 10% helping. And that was from the 5 top biomedical journals. There are
Mm-hmm.
tens of thousands of biomedical journals out there, and a lot of them are going to have, frankly, not great studies that are being published. So you see that it's probably well south of 10% of studies that are actually resulting in something that's actually helping human beings. And when you think about, sorry, I'm just going, just want to finish this point.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about the amount of resources that are poured into animal experimentation, which is an unqualified failure, you think about the money, about the brain power, the laboratory space, universities investing in these places, all of that. You just think, when you're getting so little return for this, you really have to wonder about priorities. And
Yeah. And I mean, wasting young, brilliant minds also. Like, I was dating a woman who went to UNC Chapel Hill, was getting her doctorate there. And I remember going with her into her lab where she was studying the effects of cocaine on rats. And I remember seeing, and this will tie back to this Massachusetts footage that we just got. The rats, they had, their heads shaved. They had these little nodes put on their brains. They had like parts of their skull removed. Like it's like a horror show. For some reason, back in that day, I mean, we're talking decades ago now. It didn't register to me like how awful this was. I don't know why. And I'm sure, to young people, and this was someone who is a very kind, compassionate person. This is what she's doing with her time. It's wasting her time. She was brilliant, of course. And yeah, and now I've seen that in this investigation or in this insider footage that has come out in Massachusetts, kind of the same thing. And this is going to sound kind of gruesome. It's like a horror film, but it's like you see the monkeys, with parts of their head taken off, and these things attached to them. It's horrific. We wouldn't do this to our worst enemies. I wonder, I understand like some people this part might be a little gruesome for some people, but if you could just describe, and I just did to some extent, if you could just describe a little bit of what we saw up there at Mass General Hospital.
Sure, Jeremy. I do want to say something about your former girlfriend who worked at UNC. And I have no doubt that she was brilliant, and compassionate and kind. There are several of my colleagues formerly worked in laboratories, and we actually worked with some filmmakers. And they put together something called Test Subjects, where these 3 colleagues, Emily Trunnell, who's a PhD in neuroscience, and Francis Chang, who has a PhD, I think, in biochemistry, and then Dr. Amy Klippinger, whose background is in genetics. So these 3 women all were told that they had to use animals to finish their PhDs. And, you're talking about people who are in their early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
They are, they're wide-eyed when they go into science.
Mm-hmm.
They're excited to do well. The way Frances talks about it is that, when she was in high school, she was just really good at dissecting. And it's one of those things where your teacher tells you, oh, you're very skilled, in doing that. And so you appreciate, that positive feedback. If you're told that you have a very good brain for science, that you really understand these processes and all of this sort of thing. I mean, it's a feedback loop. So you're going to think, oh, yeah, I want to do this. And you want to please other people. And you want to make a difference in the world. So if you're told that the way we do biomedical science, the way we advance cures and treatments for human beings is by using animals and doing some, pretty unsettling things to them that may cause us to feel not good. Well, what the message was to these three women who are my colleagues and whom I admire and appreciate very much, they're told, that the message to them is tamp down those feelings. Those feelings are not okay. And if you want to be a good scientist, if you want to help other human beings, you have to just tamp that down and continue and do your best. So, that's the story that they tell in this film called Test Subjects. It's about 15 minutes long, and you can find it on YouTube. But
We'll
yeah,
link to it.
oh, great. Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
My friend, Dr. John Gluck,
Yeah.
and I don't mean to deviate too much, but I think this is a really important point for people to understand. I mean, I will be, come clean. As I've mentioned already, I became an animal rights activist in the 80s. And I was also young then, and, for many years as a grad student, I wore a pin that said vivisectors are scum. I saw the world as very black and white. And, in a lot of ways I still do. But, I understand that people have journeys that are very different from mine. I mean, a lot of the times what I'm thinking now is, there but for the grace of something phenomenal go I, because I can understand the journeys that these other people had, whether it's Frances or Emily or Amy, or, as I was saying, my friend John Gluck, who was a PhD student under Harry Harlow, the father of maternal deprivation experiments on monkeys. And Dr. Gluck grew up in a family in New York where they rescued animals, and, they would feed stray animals. And, it was a compassionate family, and he is a compassionate human being. And when he went to grad school, well, first undergraduate doing, biological studies of various types. And this is, now we're talking 1960s. So you can well imagine the sorts of circumstances and, animal welfare, like how much consideration was given to that back then. That's exactly what he talks about. And he's written a book about it called Voracious Science and Vulnerable Animals. Just beautiful and painful. But that's what he talks about. That he thought, okay, if I want to be a scientist, I have to just silence, this concern that I have, this empathy that I feel for these animals. I just have to, shut that off and do the science. So,
Yeah. Well,
but
just
back
real
then,
quick,
yeah.
you that when I talk about how helpful you've been to our team, like that was one of the things, like I think it was the
Oh
failed
yeah,
experiment was,
yeah.
yeah, you got us in touch with John Gluck. And I just want to share, like, we had this incredible call. I really wish we had recorded it with John when he described, I don't even remember. I think we were at the time we were hoping we could get I don't know, like a letter of support for the Ridgeland Beagles. I think that's what the purpose of the call was. But anyway, and just in during that call, he was describing his background, and it's really interesting. Like he, just for people who don't know, like you mentioned, he was in Harry Harlow's lab, and this is like one of these really infamous labs. He also describes running his own lab, getting raided by the ALF, and instead of getting angry, I mean, he was angry in the moment, but he started to think about that raid, and he started to think, what is it that these animal activists are trying to tell me? even though it's obvious to you and me, stop doing this. But he really internalized that, and then like you said, yeah, he's gone on to write books, write op-eds, and do all this incredible stuff. He's also just a really kind, very just gentle soul, like, which is very interesting that he was, you know, through the same reason as my ex-girlfriend and all these different things, like, was, sort of thrust into a violent world and had to like tamp down those. And when you said like they've told those three women from test subjects to, tamp down those feelings, it just reminds me of like the military or something. It's like, no, don't be weak. Don't have feelings, don't have emotions. Like, while that may work for the military, for some scientists who are trying to make cures, that's not a good feeling to push away. Yeah, it just blows my mind. But yeah, I just wanted to interject that about John Gluck because I feel similarly about him. He was just someone who, we've talked to a lot of really fascinating, really cool people. He's someone who really stood out to me during that time.
Yeah, thank you. I remember now that you were going to speak with him. I'm so glad that it was helpful. Yeah, yeah. John Gluck helped us with a campaign that we had focused on maternal deprivation experiments going on at the National Institutes of Health. This was back in 2014, 2015. And we had a congressional briefing, and John was one of the speakers there, along with my colleague, Catherine Rowe, and Dr. Catherine Rowe, and also Dr. Barbara King, who's an ethologist, a primatologist, has spent decades observing primates in Africa in Amboseli Park. And yeah, I mean, all three of them, I could listen to them forever. And yeah, John has, I mean, his trajectory is so fascinating. And, he comes from a place of so much knowledge in terms of understanding what goes on in the laboratory world and, what oversight looks like, doesn't look like, what, ethical use, so-called ethical use in quotes, obviously, is. And he just has all of that. And then he has like this phenomenal philosophical understanding of how human beings operate, from his own trajectory, from his own circle of friends and everything that's happened since. I mean, I just like, there's just something so deep and really meaningful in what he conveys. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, we diverged. I wonder if we could
Sorry.
just, no, it's okay. We'll do that a lot, I'm sure, because we have thoughts swimming around in our heads. But yeah, I wonder if we could just describe, like we were going to do, what the monkeys in Massachusetts were going through that was shown in this investigation, or again, insider account, basically.
Sure. Yeah. Well, there are a few different things that were going on. Some of the monkeys, well, baboons, were used in xenotransplantation experiments. So, xenotransplantation is when organs from a different species are transplanted into uh, a different species. So, most people have heard now that there are human beings who are walking around with organs that were taken from a pig. Pigs are now being bred for this purpose, although the FDA hasn't cleared it. These have all been experimental, and no human being who has been transplanted with a pig's organ has survived more than, I believe, 18 months. It's, still very experimental. And I mean, the human beings who have survived are taking basically a pharmacy full of, a pharmacy's worth of drugs every day in terms of immunosuppressants and things like that. The quality of life is not good. But obviously the quality of life for the pigs is even worse, because when organs are taken from them, they are killed. But in order to study more of how to deal with organ rejection when an organ from one species goes into another species. Monkeys and baboons, rhesus macaques and baboons are frequently used in xenotransplantation experiments. So that's one of the things going on at Mass General. And so you see these baboons, and I mean, previously we'd heard from a whistleblower down at University of Alabama in Birmingham, where similar experiments are being conducted. And these are some of the saddest photos that I have ever seen in my life. To see an animal who already lives in horrific conditions of absolute austerity, privation, all of that, and without companionship, all by themselves. And then, they've had their own perfectly healthy organ taken out of their bodies, and they have the organ of a pig, stolen from a pig, put into their bodies. And they're being pumped full of immunosuppressants. And the way they do that is they take tubes, catheters, that are then surgically implanted into the animal's body. And then they put a jacket on top of the animal so that the baboon or the monkey can't fiddle with those tubes that are probably really itchy as they go into this hole that's cut out in their bodies, so that the tubes can go in and immunosuppressant drugs can be pumped in, and other things like saline or whatever drugs they might be using to try to increase the amount of time that the organ is not rejected. So of course, like for a human being who goes through something like this, it's already, something that is, frankly, difficult to imagine, because there's a foreign organ in your body, and your body's immune system is going into overdrive, and an infection can kill you because you've got these immunosuppressant drugs happening. These animals who are used in these experiments end up having a lot of abscesses, for the brief period they're still alive. And their bodies are basically shutting down. And you see like this extreme pain, and the sense of just not knowing what's going on. Like it's like their body has betrayed them. There's a lot of pain. The lack of empathy in laboratories is so extreme that we have seen protocols, not from Mass General specifically, but for example, from Columbia University, a whistleblower shared some protocols of xenotransplantation experiments that were going on there. And we saw the amount of pain relief that was being given after the surgeries. And a veterinarian who looked at this for us said, that is not enough. So you just think about the amount of pain that these animals are in, and their bodies basically giving out. So that was something that we saw with the Mass General experiments. And then the other experiment that you mentioned was the monkey who'd been subjected to a craniotomy. And this procedure is so prevalent across the United States and around the world, and it's just shocking. It's, as you say, it's like the rats in your friends in the laboratory in which your friend worked at UNC, where they cut an incision into the head and open it up, and then they use a drill. Sometimes it's a hand drill and sometimes it's a motorized drill, to basically saw open the skull. So they remove a portion of the skull, and then the brain is exposed. Well, there's the dura, which is the protective layer on top of the brain, and that's they scrape away at that, and then you've got the brain. And so there are different procedures that are done. What we saw at Mass General is that they had implanted basically a pole into, I'm not using the right term now, but it's basically like a stick that gets implanted, a head post. They implanted a head post into the monkey's skull. And they do this for various reasons. The head post is used so that when the monkey is removed from the cage and they want to study a part of the brain, they can use the post to screw into a bigger restraint apparatus. So you can restrain a monkey, they'll restrain the monkey in a chair. And, so the hands, the arms are restrained, the monkey's torso is restrained, everything's strapped in. But they want the head to be stock still. They don't want the head to be moving at all. And that's the purpose of the metal post, is to screw the metal post into this larger apparatus so that the monkey's head is totally still. And so this is like a stereotaxic device, overall. And what they're doing, at Mass General, at places around across the country, around the world, is, they do the craniotomy where they've cut into the skull and expose the brain. They implant electrodes into the brain. Now, this is not to electroshock the monkey. This is to take recordings of blood flow. And the whole idea is that, there are different types of experiments. We had received via a public records request photos and protocols from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We had to sue the university to finally get this stuff. But in those experiments, just to give an example, they were using cats, and the cats were subjected to these craniotomies. Electrodes were implanted. Now, why did they do that? They did it because they were trying to understand sound localization. And what that means is that if somebody were to, explode a firecracker, across the street, which was happening a lot a few days ago. But if somebody were to make a big noise over there, I would turn that way to see where the sound was coming from or what was going on. That sound localization. And there are certain parts of my brain that are lighting up when I hear the sound from over there. And that's what they want to know. They want to know what parts of the brain are lighting up in the cat when we smash a beaker, in this part of the laboratory, make a sound over here, make a sound over there. So that's a very common experiment. We got that lab shut down, funding withdrawn, and the whole thing. There were some cats who survived all of that, and they were adopted out. But there are variations on the theme. So, maybe somebody wants to look at eye tracking, what parts of the brain light up, when my eye goes this way or my eye goes that way, or up or down or whatever, or if I change colors or look at shapes, which parts of the brain are lighting up then. So people are studying the visual cortex to look at these sorts of things. But, that's going on at Mass General as well. I mean, the horrifying thing is that there are non-invasive, non-harmful ways to answer the same questions using human beings, because now we have fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. We have CAT scans. We have other scans that can be used, to figure out what's going on in the brain when different things are happening in our environment and we're engaging with our environment in different ways. The problem is that a lot of these people who are in laboratories started 30, 40 years ago, and fMRI didn't exist then. But rather than learn something new, they would just prefer to drill holes in monkey skulls and do all of this other stuff. I'll just add, since we're talking about all this, and then I'll shut up. We have a campaign right now targeting a set of experiments going on at the National Institutes of Health, where this experimenter named Elizabeth Murray has been doing, the same protocol, doing the craniotomy. So she's, drilling the hole into the skulls of monkeys. She uses rhesus macaques, very intelligent monkeys. So she removes a portion of the skull. And then what she does is she is interested in the amygdala, so, a part of the brain. And she will inject neurotoxins into a part of the amygdala to basically kill part of that brain, or she'll aspirate. So basically think of suctioning out, part of that brain to destroy it. So it's like permanent traumatizing brain damage that she's inflicting on these monkeys. And this is to understand, I mean, her most recent experiments were about understanding fear. And so the question was, if she destroys, this portion of the brain, will the monkey's fear to things like rubber snakes, realistic looking rubber snakes and spiders, will they exhibit less fear? That's what she does. It's
Yeah.
like the most
Terrorizes
yeah,
them.
yeah, entirely.
I mean, it's so insane. I mean, to hear it all described, I I made the mistake on YouTube one day of watching a video about Louis the Eighth from this channel, and since then, YouTube algorithm knows that I'll click on something if it's like some medieval crazy way that people were tortured, and so I've seen all kinds of ways that we've been horrible to one another.
Yeah.
Um, and nothing compares to what we do to animals today. It's just insane. Like the way you described the monkey being bound and have their this thing inserted into their brain to hold their head in place, and they're being held in place by, I guess, their skull or their brain. It is insane to me. Like, you couldn't dream up a more torturous experience. And plus, like, all throughout this, they're monkeys and they have no idea what the hell is happening, why it's happening, all this, like, just the amount of I just the amount of hopelessness they must feel is just incredible. Um, and also, to go back to the xenotransplantation, like, what a more like speciesist, like human supremacist thing that we could possibly do to you know breed animals to take, presumably some of the people who need like a xenotransplanted pig heart, which they don't, um, is someone who's like eaten themselves into a situation where they have a lot of heart damage. So they probably eating pigs. Then we breed the pig to take their healthy heart from them to put in the person who presumably is going to live, like you said, at most 18 months more, to eat more bacon, more pigs, and all this stuff. And I say all this, I understand, like, we've all seen family members go through struggles. I have sensitivity to that. I understand that people would want their loved ones to survive. Their loved one shouldn't be at the expense of another, though. That, to me, is just insane. And yeah, it's just it is just human. It's like we can't claim to be better when we're doing stuff like this to innocent animals. It's insane to me.
I
Sorry, I went on a
agree.
little rant.
No, it's good. It's good, Jeremy, and I agree with you. But I just also want to add to that, it's not a thing of humans versus animals in the sense of we don't have to choose one or the other. Um, you know, the other side will say, oh, well, there's a shortage of human organs. And, I'm looking out there and, if I'm driving down the street,
Mhm.
there is no shortage of humans. There are a lot of people out there, you can't, just
Right.
a glut of folks. I don't even remember what the current population is, like probably close to 10 billion, if not more. There are a lot of people. What we have a shortage of is organs that can be transplanted. And so, why is there a shortage of transplantable organs? I mean, part of it is because we don't have presumed consent in this country. We know, and that means that uh, if we die and we haven't had conversations with our loved ones about what we want to happen to our organs after we've died, a lot of families will say, well, just, bury them, cremate them, whatever. They don't feel comfortable saying, no, please use her heart, her eyes, her, liver, whatever, kidneys, and transplant into a human being. Because countries that do have presumed consent, they find that the availability of organs for transplant just increases, uh, incredibly. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if exponentially is quite right, but a lot. It increases, and you don't have the same shortages. And there are other policy changes that can be made so that we have human organs that are available. There's a lot of work being done, and I think in South Korea they've even used 3D printed, bioprinted organs for transplant, and these are going to be human. bioprinted organs, using human cells. There's a lot of talk of, my genetics, my physiology, my everything is going to be different than yours, for example, Jeremy. And so if I were to, like, let's say, face some kind of kidney dysfunction, then we could start taking stem cells from a biopsy of me. And, that can be grown then into something or used in some way to develop a 3D bioprinted kidney that can be transplanted into me. And then the chances of rejection are so much less because not only is it the right species, human, but it's also the right person, Alka. So,
Right.
you just have, but, I remember when I was a grad student, and this was at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, in London, Ontario, there was a person, there was a lot of talk then, like the whole, fantasy of xenotransplantation was starting that then. And this was like 1987, 1988, quite a while ago. And the person who was very high up in the particular department that was being asked to take this program by the federal government was saying, no, this is a boondoggle. This isn't going to work. There are too many problems. We have enough problems with transplants from humans to humans. So this is, pie in the sky ridiculous, Frankensteinian, tinkering.
Yeah.
And then the government offered a lot of money, millions and millions of dollars. And lo and behold, that same person who was naysaying said, okay, we'll do it. And, there's just a lot of money in this. And there are a lot of private companies that have come up, that United Therapeutics or others, Revivicor, that have come up that are really hoping to, get FDA approval, because then, this is like a huge, profit opportunity for the companies that operate in this space. And, the problem is that right now they're using humans, who are desperate as the human guinea pigs for their experiments. And then the larger population may end up being the human guinea pigs. But it's just, absurd. It is the sort of high-tech tinkering for a problem that has a simple policy solution.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen that new documentary that came out on Amazon Prime called the Undercover Inside the Bunker? Yeah, highly recommend
Yeah.
people to watch that if you have Prime or find a way to watch it. But that's about an insider who went to work inside a lab. So it sounds to me like from the work that you do, you work a lot with these insiders, and that was a very eye-opening account of just how difficult, how sensitive, how hard it is to be someone who's like undercover in a lab. So I don't know the extent of the person who has shared footage from inside mass, if they were like someone who went to work in there for that purpose, or there's somebody who saw what was going on and said, I need to film this. It could be different situations. But I guess the question that I'm getting at with this one is just that was like a spy novel. It was like a spy movie, right? I mean, it's really intense. And this woman who went inside this lab had this guy on the outside that she was, meeting in secret to give him the footage. It's really intense. And it sounds like this is the kind of thing that you do day to day, all the time. In some extent of working with people who are on the inside, like that must be quite a life. And I know that it must be difficult in some instances to talk about because you can't reveal who these people are. You can't. There are considerations, basically. But I'm just kind of wondering, is that somewhat kind of what your life is like to some extent, or what?
Not my life. My life is behind this computer or at this
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
computer,
Right. Right.
and then sifting through things that people send to me.
Mm.
I mean, I work with a lot of whistleblowers, and I mean, we even had a whistleblower case that has really taken off in India. It was a couple of people who worked in a big contract testing laboratory in southern India outside the city of Hyderabad. And just horrific stuff. I mean, if people want to look it up, the name of the facility is Palamur, Palamur. I mean, a lot of these people don't know what they're getting into, when they take these jobs. I worked with this woman whose identity is now known, but I still will respect, that it hasn't been published, I don't think, anywhere. But she was working as a veterinarian at Alpha Genesis. Now, Alpha Genesis is a primate supplier. They import monkeys, they breed monkeys, and they sell monkeys to laboratories. And they also have like a small experimentation facility at their premises. They're in South Carolina, in Yemassee, and they do a lot of work with NIH. They supply a lot of monkeys to NIH. This veterinarian who worked at Alpha Genesis, she told me that prior to going to Alpha Genesis, she was working in a dog cat veterinary clinic. And it was really difficult. I mean, we all know this, veterinarians, they do their work, they love animals. They, they took an oath to protect animals. But we, any of us who have animals in our lives know that it's expensive. Veterinary care is expensive. And so there are a lot of people, especially when the economy is not great, there are going to be a lot of people who simply can't afford to take care of their dogs and cats and any other animals they might have. And so veterinarians see this anguish, they see the suffering, and they realize that they're not going to be able to do anything about it. And so, the suicide rates among veterinarians is sky high. It's terrible and very, very sad. But this particular veterinarian was just really demoralized, working in that emergency veterinary clinic. And she'd been there for a while. And she remembered that in vet school, they told her, if you really want to practice veterinary medicine, you should work in laboratories because they have a lot of money and they'll have state-of-the-art equipment and you'll have an opportunity to do great veterinary medicine. Mm-hmm. And so, she was burned out at the clinic. And so she saw that there was a job offering at Alpha Genesis. And she thought, oh, wow, I'm going to learn so much. And this is going to be, really great. And then she saw that she was like stepping, out of the frying pan into the fire. It was just hideous. And monkeys were dying left, right, and center of, untreated abscesses, infections, and things like that, because the monkeys are so stressed that they're fighting with one another. They're, sustaining terrible wounds, all of this sort of thing. And then other things, it's a breeding facility. So there are always pregnant animals, but they don't take care to have the equipment in the right places. And so monkeys have died, while they were trying to give birth. Just really like you think you've stepped into another world where the lives of these animals simply don't matter, because that's really where you have gone. When you go into a lab or a place like Alpha Genesis. But, like the amount of anguish this woman felt and endured and how she tried to change things from the inside. This is what we see with so many of the whistleblowers who come, the people who come to us to blow the whistle. They tried to do the right thing. They tried to go to their supervisor. They tried to rectify the situation, make sure that the animals got the veterinary care that they needed, and people just don't care. They're operating a machine, and the animals are just part of the, they're another laboratory tool as far as a lot of the folks are concerned in these places, and so they die. So what?
I'm wondering, what is it like at PETA? Because I imagine, as the main name, of animal orgs out there, I imagine when there is a whistleblower, they probably come to you first. And so I'm wondering, like, are you guys just inundated all the time with people like trying to blow the whistle on this and that, and you have to pick and choose, or is PETA large enough that, you can handle all of these requests?
We are inundated. and it takes a toll. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Another thing that I'll touch on that you mentioned earlier when you were talking about, we have these ineffective studies, they end up hurting humans. Well, in that documentary, one of the things that was revealed, I'm talking about the Prime documentary, Inside the
Yeah.
Bunker. There was footage taken of one of the lab workers admitting that he was fudging the numbers and basically asking her, how many numbers did you fudge today? Like, and then the documentary filmmaker asked the actress, I guess, at that time, because they had an actress, she's undercover. Um, did this then go to humans? So like, and she said, presumably yes. Like, so these studies that weren't even properly done on animals are now going to humans. So yes, humans are being harmed by this directly. Like, it may not even be that they've studied it and found it to be effective in animals. They may have found it ineffective in animals and then move it along, because then that's how they get the money, the grant funding, and or whatever, how it works. So that's just insane. It, it is so illuminating, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of that. And I wonder, like, have you seen instances like similar to that where people have been caught saying, "Yeah, we fudged the numbers," that sort of thing, or do you know if that's widespread or not?
What I can tell you, Jeremy, is that like the first undercover investigation that I worked on, and let me be clear, I don't work in our undercover investigations department, which is called the I. I work in our laboratory investigations department, but when there are laboratory undercover cases, I work with that department. So I'm always like one step removed from the actual investigator. And,
Hmm.
we work very much on a need to know basis, you
Yeah,
know.
right.
So, but I receive information on what has been witnessed. I see the video footage, all of it. And one of the things at this first investigation that I ever worked on, it was Covance, which is a massive contract testing laboratory. It's a multinational behemoth in countries around the world. Their big facility in the United States is in Madison, Wisconsin, where they have thousands and thousands of monkeys, thousands of dogs, and so on, so many rabbits, etc. Um, but the facility where we had our investigator was in Vienna, Virginia, which is outside of Washington, D.C. It's in the D.C. suburbs. And uh, our person worked as a primate technician. And, all the big drug companies were placing tests at Covance. Um, and, at that time, it was an FDA requirement, by the Food and Drug Administration, that any new drug that came onto the market had to be tested in two non-human animal species, a large animal and a small animal. So the large animal would either be a monkey or a dog, a pig,
Yeah.
and the small animal, mice, rat, guinea pig, etc. Um, and so so sometimes they would test the substance and too many animals would die, so it's clearly unsafe. So then you go to a different species and try this other species. So that's what was going on at Covance, was that if the test results in a particular species would not prop up the application that the company was going to submit to the FDA, they would go to a different species to see if it would work there. Sort of like the guinea pig and the rabbit again with penicillin,
Mm-hmm.
oh, killed the
Yeah.
guinea pig. Oh, but it worked in the rabbit. So let's submit the rabbit data and, kind of, trash the guinea pig data.
Yeah.
So there's that sort of thing. I mean, in a broader way, not so much in drug testing, but in basic science research, the curiosity driven experiments and everything. I mean, there's like a huge problem with research misconduct. And
Mm.
some of my colleagues, Sneha Swaroop and Dr. Catherine Rowe, they've been working on this research misconduct issue, monitoring the various sites where these things are published. And I think we're going to be launching something really big on this soon. So keep your
Oh,
eyes open.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Good to know. Good to know. Well, I'm curious, like, so you've been at PETA for like decades now, right? It's been a long tenure.
22 years. Yeah.
22 years. That's incredible. Well, I want to get back into your story a little bit and how it all got started for you. But I do want to ask also, just it seems like you've been sort of involved in these laboratory investigations, or at least departments adjacent to that since the very beginning. Um, and I'm at like it's hard to hear about. Like, I mean, this must be, and this is your day-to-day life. I assume, like, documentaries we've described, footage that we've described would be hard for some people to watch, and you're just pouring through it, I guess, like, daily, or at least, you have to see some of that. So anyway, I'm just wondering the toll that has taken on you, how you've been able to kind of shield yourself from it, or are you just okay? Like, I mean, I understand that the animals are going through it much worse. I'm not trying to trivialize or make it seem like, oh, how can we just look at some footage or something, but this must take its toll. I'm just wondering how it's been for you for decades doing this.
Yeah. When I worked on that Covance investigation, um, I would read 10 pages of the log notes and I would have to stop, and there were hundreds of pages. So
Yeah.
it's like way behind. Um,
Yeah.
and when I watched the video footage that we got from NIH of the maternal deprivation experiments on infant monkeys, we had about 500 hours of footage, and I had to watch that. And again, you watch a bit and then you get up and you go pet your cat too much and you come back and you watch some
Hmm.
more. I mean, I am pretty good at compartmentalizing, but it spills over. So, I'll like, no, nobody at PETA is paying me to cry. So, so I
Yeah,
have to
yeah,
like
right.
stay really focused on watching what I'm watching and taking note of where there are violations of, federal law, um, and make note of that, right? And then think about what will be powerful in an edit that then becomes public. So I'm very focused on the task at hand
Hmm.
and sort
Hmm.
of separating myself from the animals. But you're right, Jeremy, that it takes a toll because then I'll be watching some dopey commercial on television, totally sappy, and I'll just start bawling.
Mm.
Or I'll be listening to NPR on the radio and there'll be a sad story and I'll be debilitated. um, and so, these things like have a way of flowing into different parts of your life, where, if something happens to, an animal I know, like one of our cats, or, um, there's somebody else I love who is suffering. I mean, I know that I cry a lot more. And part of it is this repressed, grief that
Mm.
I carry, and it's just sort of what you do. But I'll say,
Yeah.
there's a story that I tell about the Covance investigation, which I think about a lot, um, because this whole thing of, the watching the stuff and what does it do to you, and, uh, how do you carry the grief and, um, all of this. So in the investigation, one night I was watching the video footage, and this was, as I said, our person was a primate technician there. She worked as a primate technician, and so that meant she was cleaning the cages, making sure the animals were fed, that sort of thing. And but in the footage, so she would be there when the animals were being dosed, and so the people at Covance, the workers, were really, I mean, they had issues, and they would take their issues out on the animals.
Yeah.
And so, there's this one guy who was really violent. Like, he would be, hitting the monkeys. And monkeys, for people who don't know, they're small animals. They're less than 10 pounds.
Mm.
And he'd be hitting the monkeys and he'd be shaking them and he'd be throwing them into their cages, slamming the door shut, and tails would get caught, fingers would get caught, all of this sort of thing. So
Uh,
he was known by all the monkeys as being, a really bad player.
yeah.
And so he was there. And so our investigator, she's also gone public. So I can say she was there. And, she had to witness what was going on. So this guy had taken a monkey out of the cage and was going to be dosing the monkey, giving the experimental drug. And there was a monkey in an adjacent cage who was like stretching out her arm to try to pull at the guy's lab coat to try to stop him from hurting this other monkey. And it was really an astonishing scene, and you can see it. It's on YouTube. But it's an astonishing scene because you think about what these monkeys' lives are like, and the fact that they have nothing, and the fact that they themselves are probably, in 11 worlds of hurt for having been dosed and suffering and everything else. And she has no power. She's probably been beaten up by this total bully at some point. And yet she is trying to help this other monkey. And, that lesson in empathy and in like a sense of, I may not be the most powerful person in the world, but I'm going to do what I can. Like that really stayed with me. I'm not going to lie. There are times when I just think I can't do this anymore. I would like to take a weekend off and think about nothing.
Yeah.
But then I think and there are other times when I think, I wish I was smarter. I wish I were more articulate. I wish my brain wasn't, in this like state of collapse as it is right now. I wish so many things. I wish I was more persuasive. I wish I was, dynamic or whatever. But then I think, if this monkey could do like what she did to try to help this other monkey, I'm a human and I, speak the language. I work for this organization, so I have the resources to be able to do certain things. I'm going to damn well do it. So
yeah. Well, you're awesome, Alka. Yeah.
Well, this doesn't have to be my therapy session. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, it can be. You're doing well. What is it with Wisconsin? Like Wisconsin comes up so much. If I lived in Wisconsin, my focus would probably be solely on like animal testing stuff because there's so much of that goes on. That's where the Ridgeland Beagles are. That's where Covance, Harry Harlow's lab was. Like, what is it with Wisconsin? Like, I know it's bad everywhere. So like, it's bad everywhere. It's bad where I live. It's bad where you live.
Yeah.
It's bad everywhere.
Yeah. California.
Yeah. But I mean, Wisconsin just seems to be like a real hotbed for animal testing related stuff, doesn't it? I don't get
those are big facilities because Wisconsin has the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center,
right.
Thousands of monkeys there, and, so many other laboratories at UW-Madison. So you're talking about, a real concentration of animals who are being experimented on. And then, as you said, Covance, also in Madison. And then, of course, Ridgeland, not that far away, and still in Dane County. With all of the dogs in that breeding mill. It's...
Yeah,
there are probably other facilities too.
PETA puts out so many findings and stuff that I wonder, like, do y'all feel upset? I feel upset when I see some like investigation come out or something. You'll see it on YouTube and you'll see it has like 100 views or something. And I'm just like, these things should be blasted all over everywhere. And I'm sure that must be frustrating in some sense. Now I realize YouTube isn't always the measure, and it can be released all over the place in different ways. But in terms of impact, like when something comes out, I'm guessing that's not really your field. That may be communications or whoever deals with that at PETA.
We think about it. I mean, our department has to think about it too, even though we're not the ones who are actually creating the social media and all of that. I mean, we really have to think about it. I think the Mass General video has been seen a lot, which, makes me really happy for the insider and for the monkeys, and for everybody who worked on producing that video edit. So that makes me really, really happy because I think, these stories deserve to be told. It's hard though. And like, in addition to, just trying to get eyeballs, on social media, on YouTube, Facebook, X, whatever. In addition to that, there's just the conventional media, and where are they? And
Right.
so, like, this becomes hard too. I mean, I remember once one of our media pitchers was told by a reporter, "Oh, we just covered an animal issue last week, so we're not going to cover this one." And it's like, you're covering human issues every single day. There are like millions of animal species. Surely they deserve something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And hey, you're like, yeah, you had a McDonald's commercial yesterday and you're having a Burger King commercial today. Surely you can like have like some kind of countervailing, perspective on what this world is and what it could be and all of that.
Mhm.
So that's very frustrating too, to get pigeonholed into, this sort of like niche, like, sort of like this boutique issue somehow, even though it's
Yeah.
probably one of the most important issues in terms of social justice, and I mean, frankly, I mean, not to, now I'm going to get on a soapbox, but,
Mhm.
you think about the climate catastrophe impacts everybody. We see it, how many people died in Texas just now. It's like this massively horrific thing that's happening. We're not slamming on the brakes as we should be doing. But if you think of the climate catastrophe, it's rooted in this poisonous mentality that human beings have, that this earth is ours and everything on the earth belongs to human beings.
Mhm.
That's where it is. Like, that's the root of all of this. And so until we address this speciesism,
Mhm.
this like toxic and totally psychotic relationship that we have with the rest of creation, we're just going to be fiddling away, like, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe I've got solar, panels on my roof, and, I turn off the tap when I'm brushing my teeth, all of these sorts of things. But this is all fiddling.
Yeah.
We
Fiddling.
need to get to the root, and
Right.
that's our relationship with the rest of the earth.
Right, right. And I would say specifically with animals, because that just like it's kind of like you said, described in with the lab experiences, when we're conditioned and told to tamp down our innate compassion for others, like that's gonna bleed over into other facets of our life. Unless you're strong like these people were, or at least say later in their life. I don't know, in the moment maybe they went along with it because they were young, like you said,
Yeah.
like when you're in your 20s, you're working at some laboratory, you're just trying to advance your career. You don't really have unless you have that burning rage like some of us
Yeah.
have. And
Mhm.
speaking of burning rage, like so, I mean, I've stood next to you during protests, so like that's been quite an experience. It's been awesome, and so you're someone who takes part in that sort of thing as well. Um, and so I'm just kind of curious about you more personally, like how this all got started for you, how you ended up working at PETA, and like even how you like went vegan and stuff. We got to do the whole vegan story, of course.
That's
Yeah,
always a fun story. I like to hear about other people's trajectories.
yeah.
Um, yeah, my story is pretty simple. I was a progressive student on campus when I was an undergraduate, as I've said, in the early 80s. And part of my activism, so I was really focused on nuclear disarmament. This was
Mm,
when Ronald Reagan was talking about a limited nuclear war. And as somebody who at the time was living in Windsor, Ontario, which is at the doorstep of the United States via Detroit, Michigan, this
mhm.
was a terrifying prospect. And so I was involved with a group called Students for Nuclear Disarmament. There was also a lot of U.S. involvement in Central America, in Nicaragua, El Salvador, other countries. And so there was a lot of work on self determination for the peoples of those countries. And so I was involved in those things. So I was a progressive student on campus. And as part of my activism, I wrote for the student paper and I was involved in student radio. And in Canada, all of the student papers belong to a consortium called Canadian University Press. And if one paper doesn't have enough articles to fill its pages, they can snap up articles from other CUP papers.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's good. And so one such article that got snapped up was about animal experimentation. And so I think I must have been about, I don't know, 19 when I read that article. And, because I was 19 and I was involved with these student groups and I did student radio and all this stuff, I had a pretty big chip on my shoulder about being like, oh, I'm so in the know. I read the alternative press. I'm so smart, all this stuff. And when I read that article about animal experimentation, it was like a revelation. I had no idea. I had no idea that these sorts of things were going on. I didn't know that animals were used in cosmetics testing and testing of household products, personal care products, all of that. I didn't know that at universities like my own, there were people doing curiosity-driven experiments and getting money from the federal government to do it. And so I was just really shaken by this. And, I should say I was raised vegetarian, because my family's Hindu. And so for me, it was always because of our religion, because of our culture, we're vegetarian. But honestly, I hated being vegetarian because it was yet another way I was different from everybody else. And I really disliked being different because there was a lot of racism and all of that. But I was vegetarian but I'd never given thought to who animals were, because for me, my vegetarianism was because we were Hindu. And so this article really shook me up, and it really made me think about, well, what is our relationship with other animals and what should it be? Anyway, a month after that article was published, I was sitting with the editor of the student paper who was a friend of mine, and I said, Kevin, somebody really needs to write another story about that animal issue. It seems really important to me. And as a good editor, he said, well, why don't you? So I had this assignment, and so I started digging into this whole thing. And, I went to the library because it was pre-internet, and I found Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. I learned that there was this animal liberation movement. I found that even in my hometown of Windsor, Ontario, which is a small, blue collar lunch bucket town, there was an animal rights group called ARC2. And so I started going to their meetings. And I went and I spoke with an animal experimenter on our campus to get their side of the story. Did not find it convincing. And so I, wrote this article on animal liberation. And that's something when I read Singer's book, what really hit me was that sort of thesis I had about the whole world, my 19-year-old brain, that there are the oppressed and there are the oppressors. I saw that notion, that what animal rights was all about fit into that bigger framework. And so I saw animal liberation as an extension of the other social justice things I was concerned about. And in fact, shortly after that article was published, we had a rally on our campus, which was to promote and talk about animal rights. And, my friends from the progressive causes, they all came out, and some of our friends who were musically inclined, the Fierce Bad Rabbits, came and performed, and it was awesome. It was really, really great.
Rabbits.
Yeah,
That's a good name.
yeah.
Can you find them on YouTube? We have to find the Fierce Bad Rabbit.
Oh, I think they're long defunct. I mean, that may have been their only show.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Well, great name. Thank you, Fierce Bad Rabbits. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, that's so interesting. So it's like, that's very interesting that your line from sort of being introduced to animal liberation topics was from laboratory stuff. So you went right from that. There's almost like a straight line between that and to PETA almost.
Well, yeah, almost. I mean, I did work on animal experimentation issues as a grassroots activist, and the thing that gets me about animal experimentation issues is that when I think about animal experimenters, I think, these are people who, like me, had the luxury of a really good education, and they have, the world is before them, and they have so many options of what they can do with their lives. They occupy this place of extreme privilege. And yet what they choose to do is to go into a lab every day and pick up a scalpel, pick up a, drill, pick up, restraint devices, and basically exact violence on animals who are completely vulnerable. So that really gets me, that these are people with privilege who are choosing to do this. So that always resonated with me. But, after some years of working on animal experimentation and really being pummeled, like especially when I was a grad student at University of Western Ontario, we had Ingrid Newkirk come to our campus, just speaking about how much PETA was there for me. She happened to be in Ontario, the province of Ontario in Canada, and for something else. And she took the trip down to London to do a talk for our group. And, of course, we promoted it. And there were 300 people who came out. We had a pretty big group. But there were 300 people who came out. Half of them were animal experimenters, because it was a big vivisection campus. Like and it still is. Huge vivisection. And they would come and they would disrupt. Dr. Neil Barnard from Physicians Committee came to our campus as well. Again, huge turnout, but a lot of those people, at least half of the audience was vivisectors, totally rude, interrupting, heckling, just being their regular bully selves. So we just were really always doing this. And so I was still in grad school in 1989. And at that time, John Robbins' book, Diet for New America, came out. And I read that. And I went to Toronto to see Robbins speak. And I'll never forget, so after I read Singer's book and I was getting all the stuff from PETA, and one of PETA's newsletters had a story about a downed cow, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. It's basically a story of somebody who goes to a slaughterhouse and there's a cow who had been taken to the slaughterhouse because she was no longer giving milk, to commercially viable levels. And so she had gone down, she was no longer ambulatory. And it was about her in the hot sun and how nobody cared about her. Nobody cared that she was weak and in pain and everything else. And I read that and I knew I wanted to go vegan, but I was still living at home at the time. And my mother was sort of going crazy at the thought of my not consuming milk. And it was just too much. And so I couldn't do it. And, I was also weak. I don't want to blame my mother. It was me too. I just wasn't sufficiently committed to making the change. But Robin said something, when I went and saw him in Toronto. He said, when you know about these systems of abuse, factory farms, the violence of slaughterhouses, the forcible impregnation of dairy cows who are used for dairy, the fact that their infants are taken from them days after they're born, permanently separated from them so that they can become dairy cows like their mothers if they're female, or they can become veal if they're male. When you know that all these things are happening and you just think, well, I'm still going to buy the product. What you're saying is, I know what you're doing, but it's okay with me. Here's some money, do it again. And that, it was like a planet was hurled through me. It was such a seismic shift in thinking about what it means for me as a consumer to be putting my money into something that I know is wrong. I hear a lot of people saying, oh, but it doesn't really make a difference. Your $20 won't make a difference to how the bigger economics of this all shakes out. but I think that fundamentally at a very individual level of who are we in this world and how do we want to show up in this world and what are our values and how do we demonstrate those values? Like Robbins communicated that in a way that was just really profound to me and still I think about a lot. And, was thinking about more, since he passed away very recently. But that's when I went
Mhm.
vegan and
Wow, wow.
have not looked back.
That's amazing. It's also just eerie to me how many times I've heard John Robbins' book cited in the past few weeks. Like
Oh,
I had Jerry Vlasic on; he cited that as one of his reasons for going vegan. That and a book by Tom Reagan, and then also Peter Singer, of course, which we've heard about a lot. Now, I think it's interesting like for a certain generation of activists and animal rights people, it seems like a lot of people came to it through Peter Singer's book or from John Robbins' book, it sounds like, which is very interesting. Like I very interested in like books like I'll just shout out Will Potter just put out a book yesterday, and I don't know if we're as much as of a reading society anymore, but I hope we are, because this is sort of what drives people to make change. I kind of think, even though it wasn't me, it wasn't a book, it was Earthlings. However, yeah, I'm reminded of like Ingrid's book Free the Animals, and she's describing the ALF and how back in the day, and I think when Valerie went to the UK to train with the ALF, um, they were basically saying, okay, here's part of your reading material. And it was Peter Singer's book. And so like everybody was like, asked to read Animal Liberation, which is so interesting. Um, Okay, well, so I didn't form a question from that, but I kind of want to talk about a little bit about how like PETA was involved, with receiving information from the ALF. I think that's pretty fascinating. It sounds to me like when you got started with PETA, was that still going on? Like what, or I mean, for all I know, it still goes on, but I don't really know. Um, yeah, is
yeah.
there?
So I mentioned that I learned that there was an animal rights group in my hometown of Windsor, Ontario called ARC2.
Right.
Um, and so the first meeting of theirs that I went to, they were screening a film that they got from PETA. Um, and it was called Breaking Barriers. And it had just come out. So this is like 1984, 1985, thereabouts,
Hmm.
and maybe 1983 in the early 80s.
Hmm.
So film, this video, Breaking Barriers, it was shot by a group called True Friends, as I recall, which was like an ALF-esque group,
Hmm.
where they went into a laboratory called SEMA, SEMA. It now goes by the name BioQual. But they went into this laboratory, and this is, as you know, right around when the AIDS crisis hit. And so when the AIDS crisis hit, NIH went into overdrive breeding chimpanzees for
Hmm.
HIV/AIDS experiments. And so SEMA was one place where there were these chimpanzees who were infected with HIV in the hopes that they would get AIDS so they could be studied. But as you, of course, probably know, chimpanzees don't get AIDS. You can infect them with a lot of HIV and it's just not going to happen. So
Hmm.
they ended up being, a worthless model for studying AIDS. But
Yeah.
anyway, SEMA had these chimpanzees who were kept in isolate chambers. Think of a refrigerator with a glass front. And so chimpanzees were kept in solitary confinement in these isolates, as they were called. And, these were young chimpanzees and they were rocking back and forth. Ingrid describes this in the book too. But that's when I started, was when that SEMA raid took place and the video went to PETA, and PETA put out this edit called Breaking Barriers. You know, and that's when Jane Goodall got involved in the movement as well, because Ingrid wrote to Jane Goodall and said, you are the mother, the human mother representation of chimpanzees.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
this is what's going on with chimpanzees right now. You must get involved. And,
Hmm.
I think Jane Goodall credits that with being the beginning of her activism
Mm.
because, prior to that, she was a phenomenal anthropologist rocking the scientific world, on its head, turning it on its head, with her revelation that humans aren't the only species that use tools.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, but that's when I got involved. And, shortly after that, there were like lots of these different raids, like University of California, Riverside, which is where Britches, the monkey, came from, who'd had
Mhm.
his eyes stitched and the sonar device and all of that. And there were, the John Orem down at Texas Tech University with the sleep deprivation experiments. It goes on and on and on.
Right, right.
But those things were coming in fast succession back then. And we kept getting the videos and kept screening them and kept.
Hmm. Well, again, I just hope that people in the animal movement understand how pivotal PETA was in all of this, in terms of a willingness to put out the information and to at least symbolically, I guess, be associated with the ALF when a lot of groups were shying away from it. Um, so I think that PETA deserves a ton of credit for just the courage to do that. I mean, PETA's not, I mean, not it's a big organization in terms of the animal rights world, but still a small organization when you consider, like, many other activist groups out there, or environmental groups, or things like that. So the PETA took a risk doing that. I would say a calculated and a justified risk, but putting
Yeah,
out
I,
that information.
I mean, I think you can say Ingrid Newkirk was the person with courage. Ingrid
Mhm.
Newkirk was the person who had the resolve and the dedication. And, she's always said she's never going to say anything negative about people who will risk their own personal safety, risk their own freedom, when they're advocating for animals. And I
Mhm.
think it's an ethos that, does inform the organization, but, it
Mhm.
all stems from Ingrid.
Yeah, well, Ingrid is one of those superhumans. I got to have her on the program at some point. That would be awesome. Um, well, we jumped over a little bit of your story. We went from sort of like, the speeches when you had Ingrid, had Ingrid in your town. And so how long was it before you started like engaging in animal rights activism, before you got a job at PETA? And how did you get the job at PETA? Because now you're in this, incredible position right now.
Um, yeah, when I lived in London, Ontario, and I was in grad school, my friends and I would drive up to Toronto. It was a 2-hour drive because
Mm.
that was sort of like, the big hub for animal rights activism in the late 80s, which is when I was there. And, there would be anti fur demos with 500 people, and the World Week for Animals and Labs would be a huge thing. And so at that time, the Toronto Humane Society, Vicki Miller was this giant in the Canadian animal rights realm.
Mhm.
Um, and she basically um, took the helm at Toronto Humane Society. And, of course, it was like a dog and cat shelter, like any humane society. But she cleaned that up really nicely. And then she thought, well, it's not enough for us to be a dog and cat society group protection organization. There are all of these other places where animals are being used and abused and exploited. And so she hired all of these young folks who headed up these different initiatives. So there was like somebody who focused on animals in experimentation, animals used in fur, animals who were used in entertainment, wildlife issues, and so on. And so those people became friends of mine. And at one point, they organized a conference that was called Imagining a World Without Dancing Bears. And they invited all these people from the US. And so, Ingrid Newkirk was invited, and Dr. Neil Barnard from PCRM, and there was a guy, Don Barnes, who was a former animal experimenter, who came over to the good side, the light
Yeah,
side, the
yeah,
side of
yeah,
light and
yeah.
goodness. And there were some other people, and so I was super excited to go to that. But as it happened, Ingrid wasn't able to come, so Alex Pacheco, who's PETA's co-founder, came in her
Hmm.
stead. And I was chatting with Alex afterward, and telling him what a good. I mean, his speech was really great. He was, sorry, not to deviate too much, but his speech was so good, and it was like a really good lesson on how to communicate effectively, because he was talking about how he had been on Sea Shepherd. He'd been out with Sea Shepherd with Paul Watson, and he considered himself to be this great champion of animals, but he still ate meat. And he said that he went to, a friend convinced him to go to the slaughterhouse that was in Toronto. Back then, it was sort of like the upper part of Toronto, but now it's like very, Toronto's just exploded. So it's like more inner Toronto. But he went to the slaughterhouse, and he described how the cows were there and they were hoisted up by one leg, and they're bellowing and crying, and they're trying to get out, and they're in the chute, before they're lifted up. They're in the chute, and they're trying to, get out. They're trying to scale this wall. They're defecating, they're urinating, they're crying out in fear, and they can smell what's ahead of them. They know what's going on. He's describing this whole thing, and he said, there they were, bellowing and defecating and trying to escape. And here I was, the animal lover who still ate meat. And I
Mm,
thought that construction was so brilliant, because he
yeah.
wasn't saying, you people call yourselves animal lovers, and yet you go and buy hamburgers or chicken or whatever it is, and you're consuming these animals. He was describing his journey.
Yeah.
It was like such
Himself.
a beautiful way to put it. So I went to congratulate him on that and say I really admired that construction.
Yeah.
And I mean, he probably thought I was smart because I admired him. Um,
Hmm.
but he said, if you're ever looking for a job, here's my card. Um, we're always looking for bright people.
Mm.
And I was in the middle of my PhD at the time in mathematics, and I went home to see my parents in Windsor, and I said, hey, I'm thinking that I'm going to quit the PhD program and, go work for PETA. Anyway,
You
the
did.
proverbial feces hit the fan, and, my parents were not happy about it at all. And so I stuck with it, and, finished my PhD, and then,
Uh,
got an academic position, went and did that in Newfoundland at Memorial University, was there for 5 years, got tenure, and thought, oh my God, I'm going to die here. So I
oh,
left
yeah.
and went to California. I needed a job to, be documented. And so I got a job in Silicon Valley and worked there for 4.5 years. And, at that point, I started, knowing a lot of the people who worked for PETA in the development office in San Francisco, and just got more integrated with PETA. I mean, I was doing a lot of stuff in Canada, starting my group, campus groups and all this other stuff. But when I came to the US, I had more of an opportunity to help promote some of PETA's campaigns, and pretty much like halfway through my time in London, I started focusing on farmed animal issues and
Hmm.
promoting veganism, doing cooking workshops, giving cooking classes, this sort of thing. And I did that for a long time, and including when I was in the Bay Area. And so, with a friend of mine, we did cooking classes on a monthly basis. And then I started doing a lot of the campaigns that PETA was working on the ground there. So when they had campaigns against McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's, and then Safeway, I would do demonstrations for PETA as their
Hmm.
grassroots, activist on the ground.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then this opportunity, then they knew me, and an opportunity arose at PETA in the campaigns department. So
Oh,
I,
okay.
jumped at
So
the chance.
you started with campaigns department,
Yeah.
and then you pretty quickly shifted over into like laboratory stuff.
Yeah. So I was working
Okay.
in the campaigns department, and at first my campaigns were pretty broad. All sorts of different campaigns on animals used in clothing, animals used. It was all my husband at that time was working for PETA,
Mm.
and he ran the vegan campaigns, and so I wasn't permitted to work on vegan campaigns, since that there was like a policy against people who were partnered working in the same department. So
Right.
so I worked on this other stuff. And one of the campaigns that I worked on as a campaigner was our campaign targeting Columbia University for primate experiments that were going on there. That the genesis of that was also a whistleblower case, a
Mm-hmm.
postdoctoral veterinary fellow who came to us after. I mean, that was an insane thing where she saw that monkeys who were being used in stroke experiments, so just horrible. They would remove an eye. These were baboons. They would remove an eye so that a clamp could be put into the empty eye socket, and they would access blood vessels going to the brain, and they would clamp shut blood vessels going to the brain to induce a stroke. And the baboons were given 3 days of analgesia, pain relief after that, which is not enough. And so she complained about that. There were other things that were going on, horrible things. And she complained to her supervisor, who was the head veterinarian at Columbia, and she complained to the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, which is the oversight body. And her supervisor said, "You're too emotional," and their solution to her complaints was that she was prohibited from accessing the monkey labs. She was cut out. And so when she was, still like really distraught about what was happening with the animals, she came to us. And so then we launched a campaign. And so I was going up to New York City. This is when I lived in Norfolk. So it's like the 6 hours up to New York City driving for, to have our demonstrations and all of that. But the campaign had originated from our research and investigations department. And I just really appreciated their work. They're the ones who worked with the whistleblower, and it just seemed like a better fit for my talents. And
Mm-hmm.
so I moved over to that department, and
Mm.
then I worked on the Covance case, and we're all caught up.
Yeah, we're all caught up. Okay, wow. So you never called Alex, it sounds like. He gave you the
No,
card, you didn't make the call. Gotcha,
no.
gotcha. Interesting. So it could have started much sooner, but yeah, you like you said, you had family pressures to stay the course and that sort of thing. So it was sort of actually a long time before you joined PETA.
Yeah.
Um, so I know we're coming up on 2 hours. I want to respect your time. I want to respect the listeners' time. I feel like I
Yeah.
always push up against the bounds of like whether people like most people don't watch lengthy interviews, I think anyway. So thank you for sticking around. By the way, hit the like button. I always forget to say hit the like button and do all the things if you're watching. Um, so I don't want to go too much longer, but we didn't talk about the beagles of Invigo and a more recent investigation. But I think what I'll do, I'll link the investigation below, and I'll also link the conversation that you had with Wayne, because I think you guys discussed the Invigo
We did.
beagles. I did. So I'll link that below. We can always do a part two, but there's a lot more to discuss about that sort of thing. But I do want to ask you if you feel a little encouragement, a little hope lately. Like, I am no fan of the Trump administration. However, the Trump administration has made positive moves on animal testing. Like, NIH seems to be moving away. I don't know. I want to credit White Coat Waste has done a lot of good work. PETA's done a lot of good work. But how are you feeling right now? Do you think we're on a good trajectory, or is this something that you like? I want to say, like, I've seen this before too. Like, these sorts of comments about moving away from animal testing have been made before. They've been, you know, floated and then withdrawn. So anyway, do you take it seriously? Do you feel hopeful, or are you cautiously optimistic? What would you say?
I'd say I'm very hopeful. I'm very optimistic. And a lot of that's rooted in what's going on at NIH right now. So on April 29th, people can look this up. On April 29th of this year, NIH issued a news release in which they announced that they were having this new office, Arriva. I can't remember what that stands for right now. But basically, they were talking about, I mean, if you read that news release, you would almost think it was a PETA news release because they talk about the fact that animal experiments are not reliable. They don't produce human relevant data. They talk about the need to move to non-animal human relevant modes of research. You know, one of the issues, Jeremy, is that heretofore, like if you look at who the NIH directors have been, they've been animal experimenters. You know, Francis Collins was an animal experimenter. The others, you know, Fauci, Anthony Fauci was an animal experimenter. He experimented on monkeys and dogs and other animals. Now, Jay Bhattacharya, who's the current NIH director, he's a physician and he's an economist. So, you know, he brings a different set of eyes to NIH's mission and how it can be achieved. So if you look at that April 29th news release, you know, they talk about the failure of animal experiments. You know, Bhattacharya, you know, the new leadership at NIH, they're not beholden to the animal experimentation paradigm in the way the other directors had been. And they can look at the data. And, you know, we are in a position today that we weren't in 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, where we do see, you know, all of these phenomenal researchers at Harvard and Johns Hopkins and University of California, San Diego, and so many other places working on organoids, organs on chips, you know, artificial intelligence, these massive databases with the power of supercomputing, you know, all of that, 3D bioprinting. You know, there are so many ways we can answer research questions without going to this totally outmoded methodology where you're cutting up animals and killing them and, you know, extracting their organs and tissue. So, and you know, and that at the end of the day, getting data that's simply not relevant to human beings. And I think that now we can have a clear-eyed view, and that's what's reflected in that April 29th news release. So we, you know, just yesterday there was a workshop that was hosted by NIH, and you know, there were people from EPA and FDA as well, and they were all talking about moving away from animal experiments and the technologies that they're going to use to supplant animal experiments. You know, there are some really important policies, you know, like, for example, they're going to be putting more training, more money into training people in these non-animal methods. Yesterday, they announced, Dr. Nicole Klein-Stroyer announced, she's the head of this Arriva, which is in the office of the director. She announced that NIH is no longer going to offer funding opportunities, you know, put out grant opportunities, which are animal only. So, you know, if you look at the history of grant opportunities from NIH, so many of them were, oh, find a new animal model for Alzheimer's, find a new animal model for cancer, this particular cancer, find a new animal model for sepsis. These are animal only funding opportunities that were being put out to the research community. But now Nicole, Dr. Klein-Stroyer, was saying that, no, we are not going to have that anymore. You know, if animals are going to be used, you have to show that you're trying something else as well, you know, something that's actually going to be human relevant. You know, that's something that's really promising. And this is not a US only thing. Earlier this week, there was an announcement on Monday that the largest primate laboratory in Europe, which is in the Netherlands, they have 5 years more of public funding. And then it's the public funding, you know, from the federal government is going to go to zero. and they have to reduce the amount of funding that they're going to get from the public, from the federal government, is going to be reduced by 20% every year over the next 5 years. The federal government is saying enough is enough. And, there in the Netherlands, and this is mirrored around the world, we're seeing a lot of shift. So it's not just the administration here, which I cannot comment on since PETA is a 501c3. But I mean, I do think that the administration does see that it doesn't have to be beholden to the stagnant, stodgy, sort of paradigm that has really held biomedical research hostage for all of these decades. It's like we're free. We can free ourselves from all of that and embrace these new technologies that are human relevant and will advance cures and treatments for us, for the people we love, and make it a better world for everybody.
This is a bit of a tough question, I know, but maybe it's not. How do we as animal people capitalize on this moment so that it doesn't come and go and then the animal testing industry comes back roaring?
That's a really good question. I'll say, to put all my cards on the table, back in the late 80s, when I moved away from working on animal experimentation and working more in farmed animal issues, part of it was because I found it so difficult as an individual grassroots activist to really move the needle. But there are a lot of really amazing grassroots organizations that are moving the needle for animals in laboratories, and I commend them. People using FOIA in a really smart way, people putting laboratories' feet to the fire in really creative ways. And I think that's awesome. A really easy way for people to get involved in this is by partnering with PETA. So one of PETA's big calls right now is for the National Institutes of Health to pull funding from the National Primate Research Centers. So there are 7 National Primate Research Centers right now. Most of them are at universities, like the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center that I mentioned earlier, where PETA did an investigation back in 2020. People can check it out on our website. But there are other, and these facilities every year get hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government, from NIH, and they have failed. They have failed to advance cures or treatments for human beings. They breed monkeys to be used in worthless experiments. They cause a lot of misery. They don't produce a lot of help. So they need to be shut down. And so that's one of our big pushes. And so the alert that's on our website, and if people just go, actually you can just go to www.peta.org/NPRC. That's for National Primate Research Center. If you go there, you'll see the petition that you can sign, and that sends letters to your elected officials, and we're asking them to put pressure on NIH to close down the National Primate Research Centers, to pull funding from those facilities. We also have something called Research Modernization Now. PETA.org/RMN will take you there. And so some of the stats that I rattled off earlier on, like the 95%, the less than 10%, and a whole lot more, is in this Research Modernization Now strategy, which is a strategy for moving away from animal experimentation and toward non-animal methods. In fact, that April 29th news release from NIH that I've referenced a few times, a lot of that verbiage looks a lot like the RMN, the Research Modernization Now verbiage, the sorts of things that we are suggesting need to be done to transition away. So for anybody who's more science-minded, you might enjoy reading that document. It's a heavily footnoted document that goes into the different diseases, the different cancers, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, other neurodegenerative diseases, dementia, and then things like sepsis, muscular deterioration diseases, MS, et cetera. muscular dystrophy. But you have all of these different diseases talking about what sorts of animal models have been used historically and are still being used now, and why they have failed and what we could do instead. So it's a really comprehensive, excellent document that people might find really interesting. And that's another big ask that we have is we're asking members of Congress to introduce legislation that would that would that would promote the research modernization now strategy. And I'll mention a third thing, and I'm sorry, this will be my last one, but this is really
That's okay.
important. One of my colleagues is Dr. Magnolia Martinez. She's Colombian. She lives in Texas now. She's awesome. She started hearing about a lab in Colombia that seemed to be problematic, that was rife with corruption, all of these different things. And she, doing, like serious via the internet, like gumshoe investigation. She got dozens of people to speak with her about this laboratory called Caucaseco in Colombia. And, it came out that this laboratory was a bunch of cages under a tarp in a jungle. And that was the lab where they were studying ostensibly malaria. And, they've been getting US tax dollars funding from the National Institutes of Health for decades now, lots of money. And it's all been a big ruse. And, when we looked into it, we saw that the National Institutes of Health has a certain, we know this, that in the United States, it has a certain amount of oversight, doesn't have people that go to the labs, but there is some kind of oversight where the labs have to assure NIH that they're doing certain things, blah, 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 blah. In foreign labs, this does not exist at all. The foreign labs don't have to have an institutionally based oversight body. They don't have to self-report non-compliance to NIH, even when they're receiving NIH money, as the domestic laboratories have to do. And there are some other issues. And so right now there's a bill called the Cargo Act, which is a bipartisan bill, and it would basically stop funding of foreign laboratories for animal experimentation there. So we're not talking about really good expenditure of US money in, let's say, South Africa for clinical tests of an HIV vaccine. We are not talking about that. We're not talking about human treatments, US money going to help people in developing nations, in countries of the South, for, lifting up the human population. No, this is laser focused on animal experiments going on in other countries that's funded by the National Institutes of Health. And the Cargo Act would stop that flow of money because there's no accountability there. There is zero accountability. That's basically the idea. And so you can go, if you look at PETA.org, Cargo Act, you'll find it.
And I'll put those links below. So guys, you've got like 3 or 4 petitions to sign. That's one thing. It's also just focus. So, like when you see an industry on the ropes, like we've talked a lot on this channel lately about the fur industry. We've talked about foie gras, like industries that are sort of on the ropes. Sometimes I just look at it, and this is just me personally, but it's like, I tend to try to have something on my social media always talking about animal rights topics. And a lot of times it's about, animal ag and stuff. Sometimes it's good, I think, in my view, to focus on those industries that we do see on the ropes, like labs and stuff. Like maybe right now labs are sort of a good thing to put some of your focus in. And it could be signing the petitions. It could be writing letters. It could be letters to the editor or something if you're inclined to do stuff like that. Or demonstrations. We don't see a ton of lab related, animal testing related demonstrations these days, as much as I feel like we should. So, that could be stuff. I know my audience is generally animal rights activists, I think. So that's why I'm saying that. So maybe what our focus could be could go towards some of that. But Alka, it's been so informative. I always like to ask my guests to just like, what are some of the things you've already cited a few books that were transformative for you, but what are some of the books that you read like these days, like some of the things that you've drawn inspiration from, and it could be even like beyond animal rights topics if you want, but also we'd love to hear the animal rights stuff too.
I read a novel. Yeah, I was listening to another podcast. It's like from Vine Sanctuary. Trying to just having a senior moment right now. But Vine Sanctuary has a podcast, and the host was speaking with an author from, I think, Australia or New Zealand, and the author had written this novel, and it was this imagining of there was a virus that ripped through the countryside that allowed humans to understand what animals were communicating. And it was really alarming, and it would just shake you up, because the whole idea was, animals right now, they are communicating with us. They're they like in the lab, they're shaking the cage bars. They're, showing that they want somebody to interact with them. They're lonely. They're bereft. But we don't pay attention. But what if we could hear that and it was translated in our ears into a language we could understand? Like, what would that mean for us? And the way the novel, the main character, the human being, sort of deals with that issue, when there's a vaccine that people can take, so that they can no longer, they're shutting out the animals' voices. How she deals with it is really fascinating and telling. But that to me was like just so like I think I bawled for days and days and days afterwards. It was just really moving, and I thought it really beautiful. I like to read a lot of eco stuff. Like if I didn't work in animal rights, I would work on environmental issues. That stuff is really important to me.
What was the name of that last? What was the name of that last?
Yeah,
book?
that's a good question.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Well,
I'll remember it, and then I'll email it to you.
Okay, sounds good.
Jeremy.
Sounds good. Yeah.
And, yeah, I can't see it right now.
Don't worry, it's okay.
Yeah, and there was an eco book that I think I listened to it was a novel again, but about eco warriors. I love novels featuring eco warriors. That sort of thing. Yeah, just really is fantastic. I listened to an audiobook, which is quite popular. I wish I had thought of preparing this before we chatted, because, I listen to stuff, I watch stuff, I read stuff, and I don't remember it. But I listened to an audiobook that's quite popular. And right now, actually, I'm listening to an audiobook about Martin Luther King, King of Life, and that's really good.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm not going to find it easily.
That's okay.
Yeah, but there was this like great scene. We'll just leave it.
Okay. Well, email it to me if you want, and I can put it down below if you think people would be inspired by it. Well, Alka, it's been such a joy to have you on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Consider yourself always welcome to come back. I don't know, my podcast is small. Hopefully it'll grow over time. But if there's ever a chance that you think it might be beneficial to elevate one of these investigations or findings or anything through my podcast, just consider yourself always invited to come on, invite yourself on. I just don't know whether or not that's that valuable. I don't know. But
of course it is. And it's always nice seeing you and chatting with you, Jeremy. Thank you so much for your great work.
Oh, appreciate it. All right. Well, it's been great to have you, and we'll put all the links below. And so everybody, make sure you go check out all those links. Do you want, and would you like people to find you? Like, do you want to put your social medias and stuff down below as well?
Sure. That's great. Yeah,
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. So you can find Alka that way too. And I'll just tell you, like, don't inundate Alka with a lot of stuff, but if you have something important, Alka is a really helpful person. She will get you that information that you need fast.
that's kind of you. So nice to chat with you, Jeremy, and great to see you too.
You as well. Take care.
Thank you.